This is discounting the fact that individual worlds could have sufficient militia to settle individual disputes, but as they all were in the Republic, if it got out of hand, how would allies assist the potential destruction of said allying world? Episode 2 tried to hide this by claiming that the Jedi are responsible for keeping the peace, but in the same line of dialogue, Master Windu also states there are nearly not enough Jedi to protect the Republic. The novelization of the Attack of the Clones reveals that only 200 Jedi went to Geonosis during the film's climax, whereas there were roughly 1 million clone soldiers in development as stated by the character Lama Su in the film itself. More than enough to make an army. With how expansive the universe is, would it be too hard for the Republic to have an army in the case of threats such as those presented in the film? Hell, the Rebel Alliance isn't even that large or better equipped to deal with the threats of the Empire, as their bases seemed to hold the entirety of their army on a singular planet. It was enough to deal with matters at hand, and even then, the Rebel Alliance mostly had to resort to running tactics throughout the entirety of the original trilogy. Every large-scale conflict between the armies were a race against time. In Episode 4, the small group of fighters had to destroy the Death Star. In Episode 5, the rebels were escaping Hoth. And in Episode 6, the rebels had to destroy a shield generator so the fleet could destroy the Death Star. In the case of Episode 6 even, the group led by Han Solo was small enough for infiltration, while the Ewoks served as a bit of a helping hand. While, while seemingly a majority of the Empire's troops were off-planet, since very few appear in the film, and the amount on the planet seemed to be on par with the Rebel Alliance, while the majority of the fleet was up in space trying to destroy the Death Star. On the other hand, compared to its compatriots, Revenge of the Sith is the most compelling in its storytelling, showing the events that would directly be the cause for Luke's adventures in the original films, as well as the main event that most fans have been waiting for since 1980, Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side. George Lucas opted for a tragic hero motif in this regard. Unlike the previous two films, which largely ignore Anakin's growing contempt with the Jedi Order and his fall to the dark side, aside from a few scenes in Episode 2, Episode 3 puts this to the forefront and ties it with the fall of the Republic that the previous two films developed. There's your problem right there. Not enough time was focused on Anakin's fall to the dark side. Throughout the film, Anakin struggles with his desire to save Padme and remain faithful to the Jedi, but Sidious goads him with greater power and false promises, leading Anakin to ultimately reject his destiny in favor of his desires, ultimately destroying the Jedi Order and causing the Republic to crumble at Sidious's feet as the Galactic Empire rises to power in its place, ultimately causing Anakin's fears and failures to pass. The only problem the film has in this regard is the sudden shift in how the Army of the Republic turns on leadership at the drop of a hat. While this does explain why the Jedi were all but extinct, as explained by Obi-Wan in Episode 4, the fact that the army itself turns on the Jedi because of orders screams laziness and is heavily rushed. It reduces the clone army as nothing more than tools following orders and nothing else, heavily emphasizing the prequel's penchant for treating characters as tools to advance the plot, rather than individuals who can make their own decisions based on experiences made. As a whole, the difference between the two trilogies is the approach on how the stories were written as a whole. The original trilogy was a simple story about a group of rebels fighting against a tyrannical empire. Throughout the original trilogy, we're focused only on a small group of characters who are pivotal to the overall story, with their adventures correlating to the necessary events of the plot. The story focuses entirely on Luke Skywalker's fight against the Empire, and while we learn little about the Empire itself, we are shown all we needed to know by how they are represented through the thoughts of the people. By contrast, the prequel trilogy tells a story far more complicated. How an entire nation ultimately fell under corruption and ultimately turned its back on the principles that made the nation what it was, while at the same time trying to explain how these events correlated with the rise of Darth Vader. The problem was that this resulted in George Lucas focusing far more on the politics of the story rather than the emotional weight of Anakin's fall. This is very apparent when looking at Revenge of the Sith. On its own, it's the only true prequel to the original series, as it focuses entirely on events that only had been hinted at in the original trilogy, while the previous prequels modeled this concept with the rise of the Empire. Ergo, while Episode 1 introduces Anakin Skywalker, instead of focusing on anything related to the story built up by the original trilogy, it instead world builds and focuses on the fall of the Galactic Republic, by showing Darth Sidious's rise to power. Anakin himself does play a small part in the film, While Obi-Wan does the heavy lifting, speaking Lucy as his master is the more prominent protagonist, Anakin himself is just simply dragged along for the ride. During the highlight of his role in the film, he accidentally puts himself in danger by being somewhere he shouldn't even be. Though he is responsible for ending the Trade Federation occupation of Naboo, it is done so in a way that is done for the sake of the plot. He is sent into space without having any clue as to what is going on after he is taken to Naboo, despite the fact he has no reason to go with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan in order to finish the fight in Naboo. He's just dragged along because he needs to be there for the plot. On the other hand, Episode 4 is the beginning of Luke's journey. He is just a simple farm boy longing for adventure in a galaxy ruled by a tyrant. He is also accidentally dragged into conflict. He has done so within reason. He was to deliver the droids in his care to Alderaan to ensure the data inside them was returned to their owner, where he then has to rescue Princess Leia upon being trapped on the Death Star when he realizes Princess Leia's importance. Simply put, Luke recognizes the stakes of his film, while Anakin does not, meaning that in his case, as an audience, we would not care if we didn't know he would become Darth Vader. I mean, really. Yes, both Anakin and Luke were dragged into their situations. But in the case of Luke was on his way to get the job done, and then he was intercepted. Anakin was just taken because he needed to be with Qui-Gon, even though putting a child into a war zone would be the stupidest thing you could ever possibly do. Oh, it's not that they're trapped in the war zone. Let's just take a child that has no reason being here to the war zone and hope he is safe. Did that sound as stupid hearing it as it does me saying it? Yeah, I think it does. Then there's the problem of how the films approach telling the story from a connectivity aspect. In the original film, we are told about the tyranny of the Galactic Empire, but the film does little to show us this throughout the film. But in all honesty, it didn't need to, as the power of the Death Star and the willingness to use it just shows us how evil the Empire was. We didn't need to see any more than that. With this one act, the audience, and therefore Luke, upon learning the horrors of the Death Star and become invested in the destruction of the superweapon, ordering peace back to the galaxy. The remaining films don't even come close to showing this level of evil to the galaxy at large. Everything was put solely on the shoulders of Darth Vader, who antagonized the main protagonist throughout the entire original trilogy. By contrast, in Episode 6 we are shown Jabba the Hutt, who serves as an antagonist of the film's first act. And he's the one we are shown just how evil he is through his actions as opposed to being told about them. Despite this, and not knowing much about him, we are driven to care because of his connections to the protagonist at that point. However, the Emperor is a near mystery. He is clearly seen as a being of great power, but we are never told much about him, or shown much about him in the original film, other than he is the master of Darth Vader and clearly a being of great power. But that's all we ever needed to know about him. He's a tyrannical ruler of the Empire. His motivations were irrelevant as his character was defined by the horrors that he had wrought throughout the series. This was later undone with the prequel trilogy as an attempt to world build. George Lucas, in one of the creative decisions of the prequels, established the Emperor as Darth Sidious, the Dark Lord of the Sith, an ancient enemy of the Jedi, retroactively serving as an analog character to Obi-Wan and establishing that the Emperor in concept is far more powerful on the dark side than Vader, adding to the mystery behind his fall to the dark side. By contrast, the closest we ever get to this in the prequel trilogy is Count Dooku, in Episode 2, who served as Qui-Gon Jinn's master. Despite this, other than simply being the antagonist, he has no connection to either Obi-Wan or Anakin, who hold Qui-Gon in high regard to Episode 1, nor is Dooku's relationship with Qui-Gon ever explored on film, therefore not exploring how Qui-Gon's death led Dooku to join the dark side as a result. Since there is no explanation or details given to the audience about the relationships between characters we are told about, there is no reason to care. While one could argue that this effect is achieved with Darth Sidious in Episode 3, the problem this creates is that he's the only one given such treatment as to why we should care, based only on his earlier appearances in Episode 6. As mentioned before, the original trilogy had antagonists with connections to the characters that we are following. A common misconception of the original trilogy is that Vader is the main antagonist of Episode 4. This actually falls to Grand Moff Tarkin, who controls the Death Star. While Tarkin's only connection to protagonist directly is Leia, the only one he interacts with, Vader had connection to Obi-Wan, whom he later kills. This gives weight to his relationship to Luke in Episode 5, since Luke had a close relationship to Obi-Wan in the film, not to mention that the Empire was responsible for the death of his aunt and uncle. Episode 5 and 6 take this further since Vader is revealed to be Luke's father. Connections in the prequel trilogy are vague, with the antagonist's only connection to the characters, aside from Dooku, is the fact that they are there to simply be the bad guy. There are no personal stakes between characters other than that. In Episode 1, the Trade Federation was just there to be a bad guy, as was Darth Maul. In Episode 2, we are told Dooku is a political idealist responsible for the separatist movement, but neither of these affects the relationship between the protagonist and antagonist other than having different viewpoints. This tell-don't-show mentality is also a fatal flaw between the two trilogies. As mentioned before, the original trilogy didn't show us the evils of the Galactic Empire outside of the Death Star, with the only other event showing how far they're willing to go to achieve their goals is the occupying Cloud City, which was a neutral zone up until their invasion. However, these are shown in line with what we are told. By contrast, in Episode 4, we are told by Obi-Wan that Anakin was a good friend, but in Episode 2, we see their relationship is tenuous at best. This causes a problem since it conflicts with what we're told, causing their relationship to lose credibility. Though this was fixed in Episode 3, the fact that it was the only film to back up Obi-Wan's claim is a bit of a problem since it caused the aspect of the relationship to be underdeveloped, especially since they spend most of their time apart in all three of the films. As Anakin and Obi-Wan didn't interact outside of their introduction at the end of the film during Episode 1, and where they're arguing in combat for screen time in Episode 2. However, this is not an isolated incident, as throughout the prequel trilogy, we're constantly told things such as the Trade Federation, but never explained why they're important to the issue at hand, nor is any evidence presented to back up what we were told. The only thing that is done well in the prequel trilogy is the fall of Anakin Skywalker, at least in small doses, other than Episode 3. While Episode 1 is somewhat unimportant in the grand scheme of the 9-part saga, especially when being told from Anakin Skywalker's perspective, his separation from his mother and her subsequent death in Episode 2 set him on the path to becoming Darth Vader in Episode 3, showing his unyielding spirit when it comes to losing someone he cares about. As when confronted with the same possibility in Episode 3, he begins to struggle with what is right and what he wants, eventually culminating in the destruction of both the Jedi Order and life as he knew it. However, because the film tries to tie into the fall of the Republic as well, it fails to land as easily as Luke's journey in Episode 4 through 6. While Luke does also have a small dose problem in his transformation into a Jedi Knight, with Episode 5 doing most of the work, and Episode 6 simply graduating Luke to the rank off screen despite Episode 6 being set shortly after the events of Episode 5, his growth comes from being a farm boy to becoming a galactic hero by defeating the Empire. Being a Jedi was simply the side effect of his journey in order to achieve that goal. In contrast, Anakin's journey is solely depicted as him falling to the dark side, rather than becoming a hero of any sort in any manner to make us care about how far he fell. He is designed to be a young Darth Vader, nothing else. Not a hero, not a character, nothing. So any expectations of seeing Anakin as a great and noble person that he's described as by Obi-Wan, or expected to be by the audience, is thrown out the window since Anakin is treated like a child and educated like one throughout the prequel trilogy. Since in Episode 2, he constantly adheres to the Jedi Masters, even if he personally disagrees with them, to the point of making it vocal to others, even when as a Jedi Knight in Episode 3, a rank which should grant him respect, he is almost at arm's length with his allies, who not only use him as a spy against the Chancellor, because they do not trust him, they do not have any faith in Anakin's abilities to do as they ask. So when Anakin does eventually betray them, it falls flat on the movie's face, since the movie, and by extension the rest of the trilogy, set up Anakin as a character set up to fail, since he never acts autonomously from the Jedi Masters, nor has any real friendship with them outside of Obi-Wan. While this can be contributed to his tragic hero motif, much of what is on film doesn't show much more to his character as the films progress in that regard at all.